We're blessed by music in this community. I apologize in advance that I'm being absolutely plagued by allergies, and they've hit my eyes most unfairly, as well as my throat, so it's a double whammy. In our principles, we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. It's a pretty amazing set of principles and goals we've set there, and while we clearly haven't achieved them, our covenant is an important roadmap to a better world, and our North Star of affirming and promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person is as good a goal as I've ever found. And it's hard to do. I fail at our principles on a regular basis, but I'm glad they're there. I'm glad they exist as a touchstone, a goal to work toward. At this particular time in our country, I think it's very easy to feel so discouraged and helpless that we can sink into a kind of lethargy, a feeling there's really no point, that we can't make the change we need as puny, tiny, ordinary folk. I hope that when we feel this, and I feel it more often than I'd like to admit, we remember that each of us has power, the power of one, and that when we use that power in community, we can make the world better, even though it sometimes seems impossible. So today I'm going to tell you a story about a woman who embodied a lot of our principles, though she wasn't tied to any one religious tradition, and she wasn't a Unitarian Universalist. It's a story of a life well lived, of an ordinary person who stepped up to do some extraordinary things and who was motivated by love and a deep sense of justice. She actualized what the great anthropologist Margaret Mead famously said about creating change. Never doubt that a small, thoughtful group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, that is the only thing that ever has. This is a story of a woman who took her power of one and then built a community to enlarge and sustain that power. I have wanted to talk to you about Jeanne Manford for a long time. The founder of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, Manford was an amazing woman, singular and alone when she started what would become one of the largest LGBTQ organizations in the world. I admire her unreservedly. But this sermon has been incredibly hard to write, and I've gone down almost innumerable rabbit holes trying to figure out what to say to you about her and why I want you to know her. So first, I feel obligated to talk about how relatively new the movement for LGBTQ civil rights is, and how completely oppressed, legally at least, LGBTQ people were before the movement. I think most of us know about the fight for marriage equality, finally settled in the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. But maybe only a few know how relatively recent the LGBTQ civil rights movement is in America. Let the rabbit holes begin. Until 2003, in the case of Lawrence v. Texas, at the Supreme Court, same-sex sexuality was illegal in 14 states and had been illegal in every state before 1962. Arizona changed its laws in 2001, 2 years before the Lawrence decision. And it wasn't just a little illegal like a parking ticket, it was a felony. The penalty in most states was a long imprisonment, sometimes life imprisonment, which remained true in 2 states as late as 2003. Furthermore, even after the Lawrence decision, 16 states have still not today repealed their laws against sexual activity among consenting same-sex adults, which is often called crimes against nature, lewd and lascivious behavior, or disturbing the peace. Disturbing the peace is one of those things you get to say about everything. And I want to remind you that when the police arrested Lawrence and his partner for crimes against nature and lewd and lascivious behavior, they were in their own bed, in their own bedroom, in their own home, which the police entered by mistake, looking for another person because they had the wrong address. They weren't in public, they weren't acting out, they were in their own bed, and they were breaking the law for which they were arrested. Gay and lesbian sex fell afoul of an incredible number of laws, though, ironically, lesbians had far fewer laws against them and saw far fewer arrests, because women were seen as less sexual and just plain less important than men. For the first and perhaps only time, sexism was an advantage. And I say, take your advantages where you get them. When I say these laws were a large number and could be really minute, I'll give you a few examples. It was illegal in New York and almost every other state to serve liquor to people who were lewd and lascivious. So bars that served gays often couldn't get liquor licenses legally, and therefore were often under mob control, and were always subject to police raids, especially if the police hadn't gotten their arrest quotas for a while. And if a bar had a legal liquor license and was raided for serving gays and lesbians, the owners would be fined and almost always lose their license. For another example, my particular favorite, it was against the law in New York to wear less than 3 gender-appropriate pieces of clothing. If a person wore less than 3 gender-appropriate pieces of clothing, they could be arrested, dragged into a bathroom by the police, and told to strip to see if their clothing was genitally appropriate. I am not making this up. I don't have that good an imagination. And yes, that actually often happened. It was, of course, primarily aimed at drag queens, transgender folk, and lesbians who dressed as men. And of course, there were laws in every state against same-sex people holding hands, kissing, hugging, or even dancing together. Homosexuality was completely stigmatized and shameful to the general public, and it was deeply difficult to live openly as an LGBTQ person. Few families were accepting of their LGBTQ children, and even those who were lived in fear of their children being shamed, bullied, beaten, arrested, and generally abused. And all this was true in the very recent past. Some would argue it is still today, when we have a vice president who believes marriage equality is an affront to God and that LGBTQ people should be prayed into straightness. And gay life existed everywhere, of course, however, in spite of all the oppression, and gay bars were popular meeting places in cities across America. And certain cities, like New York and San Francisco, were known as havens for LGBTQ people, or at least were known as the least oppressive places to be if you were LGBTQ, though even there, bullies routinely set upon gay bars, getting into fights and beating people. Police routinely rounded up gay men and lesbians, arresting them and taking them to jail. And good people made sure they were nowhere near gay hangouts in places like Greenwich Village in New York or the Tenderloin in San Francisco. 50 years ago in 1969, on June 28th, 10 police officers raided the Stonewall Inn near Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. And as they were putting the men and women they arrested into the van, one of the few lesbians arrested yelled at the people from the neighborhood who were looking on as she was being shoved into the van, "Stop them!" And the onlookers started throwing things at the police. That began the Stonewall riots, which went on for 5 days and launched the open LGBTQ civil rights movement, which pride parades now commemorate all over the world, even here in Phoenix. 3 years later, in New York City, Morty Manford, the son of Jeanne and Jules Manford, was a gay activist handing out leaflets outside a conservative political dinner gathering when he was beaten badly by an anti-gay bystander. Morty was initially arrested for the beating and led away by the police. Later, he was taken to a hospital, and the police called Jeanne to tell her that her son had been beaten and, furthermore, that he was a homosexual. Jeanne replied calmly, "I know that, and why didn't you protect him? You're the police." She wrote a letter to the editorial page of the New York Post saying, "I have a homosexual son and I love him," condemning the laws against gays and the lack of police protection for protesters. It was the first of its kind. A mother declaring that her son was gay and that she supported him, but she wanted to do more. She got her chance, and can I have the first slide, please? This one woman, not that one, but go ahead, leave that one up for a second. That's the slide I want. She got her chance, this one woman, this one voice, when 2 months later, New York gays and lesbians held a public parade in New York City in support of civil rights for gays and lesbians in remembrance of Stonewall. She marched with her son, Morty, at the front of the parade, holding her hand-painted sign, "Parents of Gays Unite in Support of Our Children." And see how small that Pride Parade is? That was the first Pride Parade. It's not very big. She was the only straight person in the parade and the only parent. Young LGBTQ people came up to her crying, hugging and kissing her, and begging her to talk to their parents. She was stunned by the reaction she got simply by holding her sign and walking with her son. After she got home, she talked with her husband, Jules, and they decided to hold a meeting for parents of gays and lesbians in their home, which was the first of its kind. And somewhat to their surprise, several parents showed up. By the next year, they decided to formally start an organization and hold meetings in a public place, the Metropolitan Duane Methodist Church, now the Church of the Village. About 20 people came, and what is now known as PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, was born. 46 years later, now a national organization with over 400 chapters, 2 in Phoenix, 1 in Tucson, and more than 200,000 members, PFLAG has literally helped millions of families understand and support their LGBTQ children, family, and friends, and has arguably saved thousands of lives. One of the leading educational and political organizations on LGBTQ issues and rights, it's helped families overcome the prejudices and ignorance about LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ people in their own families. Their vision statement holds that PFLAG envisions a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed, inclusive of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And their mission is to build on the foundation of loving families, united with LGBTQ people and allies who support one another, and to educate ourselves and our communities to speak up as advocates and tell all hearts and minds, respect, value, and affirm LGBTQ people. It's an extraordinary organization working for the common good, and I'm proud to be a PFLAG mom, which is why I'm wearing my PFLAG mom t-shirt and dressed so really absurdly casually this morning for the primary speaker. Jeanne Manford called herself an absolutely ordinary person, an elementary school teacher for 26 years at PS 32 in Flushing, Queens, New York, the mother of 3 children. She did not see herself as unusual or special in any way. She was simply a mom who loved her 3 kids equally, and what that drove her to do what she could to support her son Morty, a gay activist who became a lawyer and an assistant New York Attorney General as an adult. Tragically, 2 years after Jeanne retired from teaching at age 70 in 1990, Morty died of AIDS in 1992 at the age of 41. Jeanne continued to work for LGBTQ civil rights her entire life, and President Barack Obama, that's Jeanne older with a picture of Morty. President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Citizens Medal, the second highest civilian award given by the United States, for her work in co-founding PFLAG with her husband, Jules, who died in 1982, and for her continuing work for LGBTQ education, advocacy, and civil rights. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 90, a month before the ceremony at the White House, and what you see there is her daughter, Suzanne Manford Swan, accepting her award. President Obama knew the story of Jeanne Manford long before he gave her the award, however, as this piece of video shows. He told the story of the founding of PFLAG at the Human Rights Committee Gala Dinner in 2009.
And Jeanne would later say, I considered myself such a traditional person. I didn't even cross the street against the light. But I wasn't going to let anybody walk over Morty. That's the story of America, of ordinary citizens organizing, agitating, and advocating for change, of hope stronger than hate, of love more powerful than any insult or injury, of Americans fighting to build for themselves and their families a nation in which no one is a second-class citizen, in which no one is denied their basic rights, in which all of us are free to live, and that's the promise we're called to fulfill, day by day, law by law, changing mind by mind. That is the promise we are fulfilling. Thank you for the work you're doing. God bless you. God bless America.
I know it's kind of a mental health break, isn't it? I wanted you to see him saying that, but also I can't say it without crying. I've tried. Because of people like Jeanne Manford, I have been freed to also be a public supporter of LGBTQ civil rights movement. I've been able to publicly support my younger son, Sasha, and his friends, to monetarily support several LGBTQ organizations, and attend the San Francisco Pride Parade with my arms around my two boys, cheering on the marchers. I've been able to teach about lesbian history in my women's studies classes at ASU, and I was able to proudly march with all of you. Can we have another slide? Yes, just go through those. At the Phoenix Pride Parade, which was such a thrill, and which I never imagined 44 years ago when I moved here would ever be possible. We all owe Jeanne Manford and others like her enormous gratitude for moving the arc of history more towards justice. We owe her a real debt that we can pay back by carrying on her and our justice work in community. Jeanne Manford lived the power of one, and she also knew the necessity of community to drive and sustain change. In PFLAG, she started an organization that she couldn't even have begun to envision when she started it. One of her friends, a Jesuit priest, Father James Martin, said Jeanne loved prophetically. And I don't think there could be a better goal for any of us than to love prophetically. That love is embodied in our UU principles, and I think that's what we are all called to do, to acknowledge the power of one, to work for community, and to love prophetically. Blessed be.